All right. Okay, so the first question. How do we organize living reptiles? This was supposed to be our third framing question from Wednesday, but we didn't get there, which is okay. And so to account for that, I've combined one of the other framing questions that was going to have its own section of slides into this one, and that is, why are birds grouped with theropod dinosaurs? So we're just going to put that right in and deal with it of how we organize living reptiles. All right, so as we go through this question, you're going to see we're going to have a series of other questions we have to deal with and have to think about a little bit. And that is that, there's difficulty in just trying to figure out what should be considered a reptile and what shouldn't be a reptile. And this is the problem. So you have this question, did birds descend from a reptilian ancestor? And here's what you have. Birds are grouped by most people as theropod dinosaurs, along with your raptors. T-Rex is also a theropod dinosaur. And so birds are grouped there for a number of reasons. One, a number of those theropod dinosaurs had feathers like birds have feathers. A lot of your raptors had feathers. And so it looks like feathers have multiple functions and don't just function in flight. And you can see that even in birds that are flightless, they still maintain feathers. And they use them for insulation, and they use them for coloration, and for water retention, and all sorts of other things in addition to flight. So that's one reason why birds are grouped along with theropod dinosaurs. Another reason is a lot of the niches that were once filled by dinosaurs are kind of, overtaken by some of these birds that are now capable of flight, but still kind of fill similar roles in terms of what they feed on, their feeding strategies. A lot of your apex predators in a lot of areas become birds following that, and you can actually trace their lineage. There are a number of skeletal features that connect birds with theropod dinosaurs, especially when you consider some of the forms that look to have both dinosaur features and bird features, like Archaeopteryx is a good example of that, and then a number of actual raptors having some bird characteristics. And so, if birds did in fact descend from theropod dinosaurs, that makes birds reptiles. And you have to actually organize birds along with your reptiles as you classify living reptiles. So that complicates this discussion quite a bit. Another thing that complicates this is, did mammals descend from a reptilian ancestor? And we'll see this in a little bit. I'll show you a phylogeny. And basically you have to keep in mind, birds, mammals, and reptiles are all amniotes, right? We talked about that last time. And so the idea is, if they're all amniotes and they all root back to a single ancestor, that ancestor would have been an amniote. The question is, would we have classified that as a reptile based on our current ideas of what makes a reptile a reptile? And there's quite a bit of debate around this. The predominant idea is, no, we would not have classified that original organism as a reptile based on our current ideas of what is a reptile, but it still does complicate things a little bit too. You have to figure out, what do we do with mammals? Do we consider them as part of this group as well? And organizing living reptiles, turtles, they just present a huge problem. Turtles are complicated. They have really unique developmental features. Their skull lacks any openings besides the orbits and the nares for having chemical information enter into the nose. And so turtles have skulls that look somewhat like bird skulls. They've got beaks like birds. They lack extra openings like birds lack extra openings. But there's a question of whether birds are ancestrally that way, or did they also descend from things like birds did? Because your theropod dinosaurs do have some extra openings in the skull. And again, we'll talk more about this when we see the phylogeny. Turtles, their libs are inside of their rib cage. That's really weird. They're the only vertebrates that have that kind of a design with the limbs inside of the rib cage. And in turtles, the rib cage fuses with the vertebrae and the scales to form the scutes that make up a turtle shell. And so turtles are just strange and really complicate not just how we organize living reptiles, but just how we think about reptiles in general. Another complicating question, why do crocodilians have 4-chambered hearts?
Because they're really cool.
They are really
Absolutely
cool.
awesome.
They are awesome. I mean, when you watch a crocodile or an alligator do the death roll on something that's just massive, I mean, you can't help but to think that they are awesome. But so crocodilians are the only living reptiles that have 4-chambered hearts. And then so the question is, well, should we group them differently and should we think about them differently as our other living reptiles? And so basically what you're left with is that this idea of reptile is just, it's really confusing. And so a lot of people have gotten away from using this term reptile, unless, of course, you have birds inside of that group as well, and you are very clear that the ancestor of all amniotes was not a reptile, was just an amniote, but would not have been classified as a reptile. And then that simplifies some things. And then adding in a lot of our extinct organisms, so organizing them, bringing in some extinct groups also helps to simplify this a little bit and understand a little bit better why would we think that the original amniote would not be classified as a reptile. So amniotes, that is birds, reptiles, mammals, and even things that wouldn't be classified as any probably, split into 2 main groups. One of those groups are called the synapsids, and these are organisms that basically have one large opening in the skull besides the orbit, and they are the dominant amniote in the Paleozoic era. And the idea here is they give rise to mammals, that mammals come out of this synapsid group. The other group of amniotes are the diapsids. And diapsids have 2 openings in addition to the orbit. That's why we call them diapsids, di meaning 2. And the dominant idea now is that they gave rise to anapsids having no openings in the skull besides the orbit, like turtle skulls and bird skulls multiple times. So one time to give rise to the turtles and their ancestors, and then one time to give rise to the birds within Theropod dinosaurs, and then some other times as well. And then diapsids split pretty cleanly into 2 groups, lepidosaurs and archosaurs. The archosaurs, the ruling lizards. The lepidosaurs, the descendants here would be snakes, lizards, tuataras. And even bringing in some of these extinct groups. So your archosaurs would be your ruling lizards. It would include your dinosaurs, would include your birds, would include pterosaurs, would include crocodilians. And then even including extinct groups, we still have no idea what to do with turtles. I mean, they're just a mess. I'll show you the phylogeny, and there'll be a polytomy where turtles come off with a question mark, and it's just, they're just very strange animals. Yeah.
Could you define the 2 groups again?
Define these 2 groups, synapsid and diapsid. I'll show you in the skulls, but synapsids have 1 opening besides the orbit, and it's back behind the orbit. Diapsids have 2 openings besides the orbit, back behind.
What do you mean by openings?
Just holes.
Okay.
Holes in the skull.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is kind of fun. I'll show you the phylogeny, and hopefully some of this will start to make sense. But I just kind of want to leave you with this idea. We've got this type of organism, reptiles, which makes a lot of sense, because if you picture in your head what a reptile is, you can picture a reptile, but there's just some really confusing aspects of using that name. And so a lot of times now we'll refer to lizards, snakes, turtles, and crocodilians as non-avian reptiles, meaning reptiles that aren't birds. And then keep in mind that the original amniote probably would not have been classified as a reptile. So here are the skulls. Here's an anapsid skull, like a turtle skull or a bird skull, except for this one has teeth. Birds and turtles don't typically have teeth. There are some extinct birds and some extinct turtles that did have teeth. Anyways, another story for another time. Here's the synapsid skull with a single opening back behind the orbit. This group, the synapsids, give rise to mammals. and then you've got your diapsids, which give rise to all the rest of your amniotes, okay, including probably your anapsids.
What purpose do the openings play in the skull? Like just for
It varies from group to group.
Okay.
In some groups, it allows for more flexibility in terms of where muscles are attached and lighter skulls. In other groups, the only way to explain it is just drift. It's just kind of a random feature that got set in place and then kind of maintained in some way. So here's the phylogeny, and here's your ancestral amniote again, and we probably would not have classified this as a reptile. That way we can deal with mammals separate from the rest. And then splitting into these two groups, diapsids, which probably gave rise to anapsids. And then so you've got extinct anapsids there, and you can even see turtles they put here within diapsids. And so, but with the question mark, it's like a polytomy here and a question mark. Like, what do we do with these turtles? Are they here? Are they here? Nobody knows. And so synapsids up here giving us mammals, and then diapsids splitting into two groups, archosaurs and lepidosaurs. So lepidosaurs are here, archosaurs are here. They put this up too high. It looks very confusing. And then you can see the groups that you basically have within any of these groups. Most of these lepidosaurs are extinct. Squamates, lizards, and snakes are still around. This should say Tuataras. Tuataras. Wow, that's interesting. This is not my diagram. This is a textbook diagram. But Tuataras, these are really interesting organisms. They look like lizards. If you saw them, you probably couldn't tell the difference between it and a lizard. But if you looked at the skull, you could see that there's a difference. And then turtles, again, we have no idea what to do with them. Crocodilians, the reason why they have four-chambered hearts is because they're archosaurs. And the idea is that all archosaurs have four-chambered hearts. Birds are also archosaurs. They have four-chambered hearts. Dinosaurs are archosaurs. They're believed to have four-chambered hearts. And pterosaurs are archosaurs and are believed to have four-chambered hearts as well. Yeah?
From a creationist standpoint, I'm assuming one could argue that turtles are part of the original.
Yeah, the turtles are a separate creation, and that's why you have such a difficult time grouping them with anything else, because their design is just so novel.
But
You know?
like, how do you explain from a creationist standpoint, like the birds of the air and the beasts of the field?
Right, so you would have to disagree with this if you believe what Genesis 1 is presenting about origins is actually true. You would have to disagree with this, because right at the beginning you have birds separate from your creeping things. And historically, Hebrews have interpreted creeping things to include the reptiles, the lizards, the snakes. I imagine crocodilians as well, but I don't think they interacted much with crocodilians in the Middle East. But they may have, who knows?
Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the Nile crocodile that they would, of course, interacted with during their sojourning in Egypt.
The crocodiles in Iran as well.
Yeah, but that's pretty.
That's
Pretty far away. But yeah, so you'd have to disagree with this grouping, and then you'd have to come up with an alternative explanation for why do these organisms share so many features. Keeping in mind that they're all amniotes, and having that amniote design allows you to do things that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise, like live in arid environments and have an existence, a vertebrate existence. You have something? Yeah, so you'd have to agree with this if you believe that what Genesis 1 presents about origins is actually true. However, you've got some interesting things that I don't think you need to disagree with. The presence of feathers in dinosaurs is almost undeniable. There are a number of dinosaur groups that have feathers. That, again, does not necessarily mean that birds came out of dinosaurs. And so what you would be looking for is you'd be looking at, okay, if we're not going to assume shared ancestry, all these phylogenies assume shared ancestry. So as soon as you go to build one of these things, you're assuming that they all root back to a single ancestor. You can't construct them otherwise. In fact, as you're constructing them, in order to get something that looks like this, you have to choose a group, bless you, that you believe to be closely related to this group, but not part of it. So as you're building this phylogeny, you would choose something like an early tetrapod that you would believe would be close to this group, but not part of this group. So again, even to build these, you assume common ancestry. So then if you went at this not assuming common ancestry, you'd look for examples of discontinuity, of where you don't have a clean kind of story as you move from one form to another. You'd be looking for examples of where there aren't any links. And so we do have one polytomy here. This is a simplified phylogeny. As you start to get into some of these groups, you start to find polytomies as well. And you start to find things that just don't fit really clean, in addition to turtles. Now, turtles do complicate this. Obviously, turtles are just very strange organisms. So here's an example of an archosaur, pterosaurs, some of which are the largest flying creatures that have ever existed. Just some fantastic animals. But they are not dinosaurs. They are archosaurs, but they are not dinosaurs. And I don't know why that bothers kids, but it really does bother kids. And so my daughter has ruined many a kid's day by telling them that archosaurs are not dinosaurs, because she knows better, but not all kids know better. They're still cool, even if they aren't dinosaurs. Here's a crocodilian. And so crocodilians, again, these are archosaurs, which gives an explanation for why do they have four-chambered hearts when all of the other living non-avian reptiles have three-chambered hearts. Lizards, snakes, turtles all have three-chambered hearts. Crocodilians have four-chambered hearts.
They were probably ancestrally endothermic. Warm blood.
Oh, sure. Yeah, for sure. All archosaurs probably were. Dinosaurs look very strange. They look like they were endothermic like mammals and birds, but they grow like reptiles grow, with growth rings and only at certain parts of the year. So they have a very strange kind of biochemistry, which is probably why they didn't survive well in a post-flood world. Another conversation for a couple of weeks from now when we talk about speciation and mega evolution. Here's a couple of examples of lepidosaurs, chameleons, and snakes. Lizards and snakes being, some really interesting groups. And then here's a wonderful example of a turtle, specifically a tortoise, which all tortoises are turtles, but not all turtles are tortoises. Anyways, if you want to kind of reference that, just like all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads, how that kind of works phylogenetically. And yeah, turtles, they're just fun. I mean, they basically, they take their home along with them wherever they go, It's, I made this reference in my anatomy class, but it's like the people that live in the travel trailers, right? And they just get bored of where they're living. They just move on somewhere else and take their home with them. But it's an animal version of that. But they're really slow, so it takes them a long time to get anywhere, so they usually don't go anywhere. But, the turtles, not the people with travel trailers. All right. So our next framing question, and here's where we'll have our lecture break if you're hungry for it and you need it. How are mammals unique? So keep in mind, mammals are in this synapsid lineage. If you're going to root all amniotes back to a single ancestor, all mammals, birds, and reptiles back to a single ancestor, that original amniote splits into synapsids and diapsids. Mammals are in this synapsid lineage. Specifically, mammals are believed to have descended from one group of organisms in that synapsid lineage called the Cynodonts or Cynodonts. And then here are some features that make mammals unique. Mammals produce fur. That's unique. They're not the only organisms that produce an insulation, but they're the only organisms that produce an insulation like this. They are the only organisms that have mammary and other complex glands, sweat glands, mammary glands to produce milk. And they're unique in that most species are viviparous, that is, giving live birth, where the mother and the developing embryo are connected. Where the mother and developing embryo are connected by a placenta. And so not all mammals develop like this, but most of them do, and that is unique among amniotes. There are other amniotes that are viviparous. There are some lizards and some snakes that are viviparous. Most of them that give live birth are what's called ovoviviparous, which viviparous means live birth, but ovo is an egg, so they just store the eggs in the uterus until they hatch, and then they birth them. Which that's kind of fun to watch a snake giving birth. If you haven't seen it, find a video on YouTube. It's fantastic. Some other things about mammals. So mammals have, including us, we have 3 bones in our inner ear. That should say ear. Why does it say air? Wow. That's horrible. And this is already on, it's already on canvas. That's embarrassing. It should say ear. rather than the one that are found in therapsids, so non-mammal synapsids, and the one that you find in living reptiles. Now we have this cynodont that, again, mammals are believed to have come from, the cynodont, Conodon, that has the 3 bones in the middle ear, but the bones are attached to the lower jaw, which this is really interesting because we have 2 extra bones in our middle ear than therapsids did and living reptiles do, right? So we have 3, they had 1, we have 2 extra. Reptiles and the therapsids, extinct groups, had 2 extra bones in their jaw than we do. And so you can see that as you're getting into more mammal-like cynodonts, those bones in the extra bones in the jaw get smaller and smaller until they disappear, and then you get 2 extra bones in the inner ear. And now you've got a cynodont that not only shows that same trend, but has all 3 bones in the inner ear, but they're actually physically attached to the lower jaw. Telling a very compelling story of how you get mammals skeletally from these cynodonts. As bones from the jaw, those 2 extra bones in the jaw, move ultimately into the inner ear. Very interesting and a very compelling story, kind of rooting mammals back to these synapsids, these non-mammal synapsids. All right, so from there, we'll talk about living mammals. Living mammals are grouped into 3 taxa. One of those are the monotremes. They lay eggs, and they just make all mammal phylogenies really confusing. Not quite as confusing as turtles make reptilian or diapsid phylogenies, but close. Monotremes are just strange. Why do they lay eggs, right? I don't know.
Is that a platypus?
Yeah, platypus, and then 4 species of spiny anteater. So there are 5 living mammal species that lay eggs and are monotremes. Marsupials have a short gestation period, but they're still viviparous. There's a direct connection between the embryo and the mother with the placenta, and then they have an extremely long lactation period. So like if you take an equally sized marsupial and an equally sized the other group, which is a placental mammal, so let's say you take a deer and you take a kangaroo, about the same mass, actually fill very similar ecological roles. And if you go to Australia, they hunt kangaroos like we hunt deer. And they eat kangaroos like we eat deer. You may not eat deer, but other people do. Very similar, just ecological role, very similar mass. A kangaroo's gestation period is like a quarter of what a deer's is. Okay, so that means the baby is in the uterus for about a quarter of the amount of time. But the lactation time, the amount of time that joey is suckling and not eating on its own, is like 3 times the total length of a deer. So marsupials, really short gestation period, really long lactation compared to your placental mammals. So the only marsupial we have in North America, what is it? The opossum. Don't call it a possum. The opossum. Okay? The opossum, y'all have seen an opossum, looks like a rat, but it's just, so its gestation period is 13 days. 13 days after implantation, they give birth to their offspring. But then they suckle for like 3 or 4 months. And so the total amount of time is still longer than what you would get in a corresponding placental mammal, similar size. All right. So here's what we're going to do for our lecture break. What I want you to do is I want you to get yourselves into groups. And again, I'm not going to count you off. I'll let you get yourselves into groups, but you need to have a leader, and that leader, you need to get everybody engaged, and that leader, you need to get a spokesperson that wants to do it. And I want you to come up with some ways in which we can explain the movement of bones from the jaw into the middle ear. Now it says ear and not air. Of the mammal. So what are some ways in which we can explain that phenomenon? That as you're looking at cynodonts and you're getting to cynodonts to start to look more and more and more mammal, these bones in the jaw are getting smaller and smaller and smaller until ultimately they disappear and end up in the middle ear. And then you've got a cynodont, Conodon, which is fun to say, that has the 3 bones in the middle ear, and they're still physically attached to the jaw. So you actually see developmentally those bones start in the jaw and then move into the inner ear in the same organism. That idea of ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. I put up on the board on Wednesday, or was that on Monday? On Wednesday. That's kind of interesting, right? It's a compelling story. So what are some ways in which we can explain this? Take a couple of minutes, get yourselves into groups, discussion leaders, get everybody engaged, and then we'll share it with the group.
Alright. Who wants to be the discussion leader?
Ross hasn't done it yet. Or I can move up. Yeah.
Alright.
What do you guys think?
Man.
Started with me last time.
Okay.
I have no idea like what would cause that kind of movement. Much less what the would be evolutionary.
One thing I'm thinking of is as you get the Cynodont kind of moving into different niches and whatnot, the jaw, like they might have adjusted their diet habit, eating habit, and whatnot. So to not maybe those 3 bones would have been there to maybe implement more like crushing and whatnot of certain foods, and so maybe they didn't need that anymore. And so because they didn't need that, the bones themselves started to get smaller, and then moving up into the ear, I guess it's just like maybe they decided to go somewhere, so they just kind of got smaller, and now we find them there.
So you're saying that based on the food that was available, their jaws adapted?
Yeah, based on the food or the environment that they were moving into or adapting to.
So basically, it was biomechanically advantageous.
Yeah.
Now,
Either biomechanically advantageous or just like it's what happened to them. Like where it might not have been advantageous for them.
If you want to go with that, give me some reasons why it's a biomechanical necessity.
Okay.
Sorry, I was talking to this
Oh,
group.
okay. But like going into the niche in which they were going into, it would have been better for them to maybe not have those 3 bones, because maybe it would have just taken up more energy.
So like they didn't need them anymore, so they got
Yeah.
reduced.
Yeah, and they had a different function to them.
you think it might have helped them to hear better?
Maybe, yeah. If they needed to.
How though?
I was thinking maybe, I don't really know what this is. I was thinking maybe like since their ears were adapting and changing to hear better, to become better like defenders rather than attackers and predators. Stronger jaw might eat animals. Better at hearing.
Yeah.
All right. So a couple of things that might have been helpful for you to know prior to this, but this is kind of fun. It's fun to see what you came up with without as much information as you could probably use. Just because there are extra bones in the jaw does not necessarily mean that the jaw is any stronger. Okay, you get very similar bite pressure dynamics from some of the mammals with the hardest amount of bite pressure as you can get from crocodilians. Okay, and then crocodilians, I mean, to actually open their jaw is very difficult for them. So you can hold their mouth closed pretty easily, right? I don't know if you've ever been to like, Gatorland Zoo in Florida or something like that, but you just have like one roll of electrical tape holding a 6-foot alligator's mouth closed, and they're like, "Hey, like get in there and play with the alligator." I'm good. This is fine. So yeah, just because they have extra bones in the jaw does not necessarily mean that their jaws are any stronger. And I will tell you that having 3 bones rather than 1 bone in the middle ear does allow for a wider range of frequencies to actually move into the inner ear and be interpreted by your brain as a variation in sound. So it doesn't necessarily make you better equipped to absorb all sound, but it gives you a wider range of sounds that you could actually differentiate from each other. Having some extra flexibility in the middle ear, allowing for different frequencies of vibrations to continue to move in, and so it allows a wider range of different frequencies to be heard and differentiated. All right. So now what do we think? We'll start with this group up here and we'll work our way back. So we have a group here, we have a group here, we have a group there, and a group there. We've got 4 groups. Love it. All right.
Man. Okay. So we kind of went with, well, before we knew that, well, we didn't know that with the more bones that the jaw wasn't necessarily stronger. So we were just going with like a biomechanical necessity. Well, not, yeah, I think a necessity where as the organism was moving into different niches and whatnot and stuff like that, it needed to adapt for that environment. And so maybe there would have been things that it needed to hear better in that environment. And so maybe it didn't need those bones in the jaw anymore. And so they would kind of shrink back and move up.
So talking about a functional reason why that might have happened. You know, it's interesting. You have to keep in mind, so I put on the slide that synapsids are the dominant amniote in the Paleozoic era. So they appear, synapsids appear, you know, in Carboniferous, and then throughout the Permian, a lot more groups start to appear, and they are the dominant group. And then most of them go extinct at the end of the Paleozoic, in that Permo-Triassic extinction. And then a lot of those niches get filled by dinosaurs during the Mesozoic. Your Cynodonts, some of those groups exist beyond that boundary. And then you start seeing true mammals appearing during the Mesozoic as well. And the idea is they're coming from these Cynodont groups. But a lot of the niches that were filled by synapsids are then filled by dinosaurs in the Mesozoic. So just kind of a whole different group comes to kind of fill that role. Now, the mammals versus Cynodonts, they are filling very similar roles. Now, Cynodonts start to get smaller. As you look through the Mesozoic, as they start to become more mammal-like, not only are you starting to see these bones in the lower jaw starting to make up a lesser percentage of the jaw, but the whole animal is getting smaller. And your first true mammals that appear in the fossil record are really small, like the size of a shrew, 2 to 5 grams. They're really small animals, okay? And so we have, if you want to go up with like a biomechanical explanation, it's tough because it's hard to make a cell that they really are entering into different niches, right? They are trying to kind of get back some of the places that are now dominated by dinosaurs. But again, it all depends on how you interpret the fossil record. So do we have some ideas here?
Well, we were just kind of talking about, the main explanation was for the purpose of the organism that during development, the bones in the jaw would move up to the ear, the ones with a Y.
Yanoconodon.
Yanoconodon.
Yeah, I should have italicized that because it's a genus, but it's also used just to refer to a group of organisms anyways.
So basically, we were just kind of talking about the whole ontogeny, recapitulates phylogeny type thing there, because that's really what we need to explain, because just seeing, you know, the 2 bones in the jaw and then going to the 3 bones in the ear, you know, technically that's not necessarily proof that they moved.
Yep.
And so the main thing we need to explain is that developmental thing.
Right.
And I just kind of brought up the example how humans in the embryo also form a postanal tail around day 30, 31, 35, something like that.
Okay.
Really early. And then it falls away anyway.
Sure.
And so I think not necessarily based on your view of origins, if that's really the case, you know.
Right, so you still have to come up with some way. Now that whole idea of ontogeny or development showing the evolutionary history, a lot of what was used as data in support of that, we've now found that it was fabricated. That things don't develop as similar as we think, but there are some weird things, like that we do develop a postanal tail, but we don't use it. And we descend, the idea is that we descend from the great apes that also don't develop a postanal tail. Well, they do early in development like we do, and then it gets resorbed. And then you've got pharyngeal slits. You know, we talked about one of those hallmark characteristics of chordates. During human development, you see them. They're not completely through the pharynx. They're more like pouches, but then they go and develop into other structures. So you've kind of got an issue that you've got to just work through. What are some of these developmental phenomena saying about our evolutionary history? Whether or not it's a slam dunk that our development models where we came from, because I don't think that is. A lot of those data were fabricated. But you still have to talk about, well, why do we have some developmental features? Why do we develop as though there was a huge yolk sac sitting under us, even though there is none, and we're floating around in in the amnion full of amniotic fluid? So you got kind of some interesting things that we have to deal with. Yeah. Group back here. Any ideas? Bless you.
Good idea.
Uh-huh.
Jaws can also be used to get prey and kill.
Sure.
So, being in a non-competitive environment, they may just need hearing to be able to hear danger and go to safety.
Sure.
And what you're talking about like frequency and being able to differentiate, well, having that increased hearing, but being able to differentiate what's danger, what sounds like danger
Uh-huh.
sounds like, and what danger does not sound like.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because the first mammals that appear in the fossil record, they're really small and they look like they're insectivorous. And so they're using a resource that's widely available. Now, there are other insectivorous organisms that you'd be competing with, but if you eat ants, there are plenty of ants to go around, right? The level of what you would call interspecific competition, where you're competing with other species for that resource, is pretty limited when that's what you're eating, which is nice. But they would be under enormous amounts of predatory pressure. Absolutely. So you could talk about what is that hearing in the middle ear, again, another functional need for it to be able to maybe better protect themselves from predation. I like it. Yeah.
Sadie has some wisdom to drop.
Well, I really like just the idea that like in humans specifically, you have every bone in the human skull being fused together via sutures, except for the jaw, which is in close proximity to the ear. And so I feel like because the jaw has to be mobile for function, there has to be a flexibility in the ear, in the bones within the ear, so they're not constantly breaking and not like gonna rupture something.
It does absolutely provide more flexibility having 3 bones rather than 1, right? There is more flexibility there to carry those vibrations into the inner ear, where it's then sent to the brain, for sure. Yeah, it does actually provide us. So there's really no way to get around that this tells a fairly compelling story that your original mammals actually came out of this Cynodont group. Okay? The thing is this is just one feature that you're looking at. Okay? It's just one feature that you're looking at. We'll come back to the same discussion when we talk about how do we interpret the fossil record. But when you start bringing in other skeletal features, the story is not quite so clean and smooth. So if all you look at is this jaw to middle ear, it looks like you can tell a fairly convincing story that mammals evolved from cynodonts. Okay? But then when you start using other skeletal features, that story gets complicated quite a bit. And then you still have the difficulty of how do you get some of those mammalian characteristics in the first place. But so I think we need to deal with this in terms of how do we interpret the fossil record and what are we actually dealing with here. And then you have to realize, I think you can deal, and then one more thing I want to tell you, is I think you can deal with a lot of the developmental similarities between us as amniotes as basically what has to work developmentally to be able to accomplish the variety of forms that you're capable of getting inside of your amniotes. And we'll come back to this idea, but that there are certain developmental themes that just happen, even if they don't get used, that just happen because of other necessary features that have to happen in the design. That some of these things are implications of those other developmental features that then aren't needed and aren't used. Yeah.
So I just have a general question about classification.
Uh-huh.
So like plants, let's classify them based on how they reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go to like, protostomes, deuterostomes. Oh, let's classify them based on how they develop. And then you get to vertebrae. Oh, let's classify them based on how many bone holes they have. It's like there's no I just feel like scientists are sitting down and like, oh, how do we want to classify this time? Oh, this
Right.
over what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and that's the thing, and so that's in one way the value of having molecular tools is of having, and what we talked about a few weeks ago, where I basically got you to admit that's the explanation for why you're more genetically similar to your siblings than you are to me is because your shared ancestor is closer.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good explanation for why are we more genetically similar to chimpanzees than we are to lions, right? It's because our ancestor is closer, right? Well, so that's the desire, and that's the value, the perceived value of using molecular information, using the DNA sequence and things like that, is you eliminate some of the bias of certain morphological features.
Yeah.
Because you should just be able to say, okay, well, let's look at the whole genome, right? Let's look at the entire blueprints to make up this organism and compare it with another organism. But the thing is, with extinct groups, you don't have that, right? So you have to try to build these things in such a way that it makes for the simplest transition from one form to another. That's the thrust of what you're trying to accomplish, is you're like, okay, we're already assuming that all of these organisms root back to a single ancestor.
Yeah.
How do we get all of the groups that we have now, plus all of the groups that we have fossils of, with as few transitions as possible? Because that's what's probably going to be the most likely account of what actually happened, is the one that requires the least amount of evolutionary steps, the simplest progression to get all those forms. And so with some groups, it ends up being one morphological feature emphasized to give you that simplest, the least amount of evolutionary steps. In another group, it ends up being a different main morphological feature that gives you the least amount of evolutionary steps. But yeah, you can't get around that there's some bias, right? There's some bias. People are going to come and say, well, what about these features, right? And the thing with Cynodonts to mammals is the only one that actually tells a really smooth, compelling story is this jaw to inner ear. The rest of them are really complicated and really muddy, and you have forms showing up earlier in the fossil record than they should when you look at some other features. But this is the one that gives you the fewest amount of evolutionary steps to get mammals in that synapsid lineage from Cynodonts. And so that's the value there. So here's the Cynodont. It's got fur. It's got some other mammalian characteristics. Here's an illustration of the platypus and the spiny anteater. Again, you've got platypus and 4 species of spiny anteater, the only living monotremes. Here's the Tasmanian devil, wonderful example of a marsupial. Really short gestation time, long lactation time. And what's kind of interesting is you basically have a marsupial equivalent of virtually all of your main placental groups when you go into Australia, where for some reason marsupials just thrive there, and placental mammals really are still struggling to make an impact there, except for rabbits and wild dogs. And humans. Yeah, they're all doing well. But other placental mammals have had a hard time dislodging your marsupials.
Which is really good.
Yeah, but you do find marsupial fossils other places. You find marsupial fossils in Antarctica. You find lots of marsupial fossils in South America, some marsupial fossils in Southeast Asia, and then you find just Australia was just ripe for marsupials for some reason. Here's a good example of a placental mammal, which actually makes a nice segue into where we're going with our last question, and that's focusing in on primates, focusing in specifically on humans. How do we get humans? If we root all mammals back to a single mammal ancestor, how do we get humans? Okay. All right, so the last framing question: how are different hominin, which is a subfamily, species related? And as we start this question, I want to ask this, and we're actually going to take another very brief lecture break, and you're going to discuss this in your groups for 2 minutes, and then we'll talk about this collectively. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human? And I know it's like 2 minutes. This is a complicated question. You could spend your whole life exploring and contemplating this question and still not come up with a satisfactory answer. Okay? But I'd like for you to take a couple of minutes and give us a start. Build us a foundation for what it means to be human. 2 minutes, starting now.
A theological answer?
Whatever you want to do. Either way.
Okay.
We have the breath of
Image of God,
Yeah.
of course. But then what does it look
we're,
like?
we're the only species that God is actually breathing.
We are the only species,
Yeah, that God is breathing.
including Neanderthals. Because they're a separate species of human.
Okay, for humans.
Let's say the only kind.
Yeah, the only kind.
Okay. We're
Yeah.
the only kind.
The only creation.
Yeah.
Only creation.
Well, couldn't like those different like or hominins and stuff like that, like Neanderthals and whatnot, they just be humans, but just like during the Tower of Babel and stuff like that too that we see that split off and whatnot, and so that could have been kind of where all those
Yeah, so
things came from.
that's kind of the prevailing thought right now in creationist circles of human evolution, is that everything kind of comes out of
Yeah.
that Babel area.
So,
And so you call it the out of Babel hypothesis rather than, because the out of Africa hypothesis explains human origins coming out of the continent of Africa.
So then that would mean that Adam and Eve would have looked nothing like we look.
Not necessarily.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. I would answer that as saying I don't know.
Okay.
But even the other things that seem to be human, they look like us.
Yeah.
You know, they may have some differences where we can say, okay, this is a clear difference,
Yeah.
but they look like us. And the amount of variation in all hominin forms, all hominin species, is not that much more dramatic than the amount of variation in living Homo sapiens.
What's interesting is that when you see differences in hominins, they lean towards an ape-like similarity. If they're different
Not
in-
necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, some of the groups, yeah, but I think a lot of those groups are clearly ape, and they group with ape when you do these analyses, not assuming common ancestry.
Yeah.
Like Paranthropus, most of your species of Australopithecus, they group with apes.
Well, yeah. So would you say anything that's in the genus Homo is a
I wouldn't say any of those are any more ape than Homo sapiens are. They're different. You know, they're just as equally non-ape as we are. They just have some different features. I
basically
mean, some of them have like a more pronounced brow ridge, which you're like, yeah, there are some apes that have that. Yeah, but it's like, well, yeah, but they still have like a strong chin. I mean, there's, you know, it's kind of like a hodgepodge of different characteristics. All right. So, as this is a discussion that has to continue, but yeah, any ideas of, yeah, and we'll start backwards. So we'll start with this group over here. What does it mean to be human?
So I guess some of the things we said was like frontal lobe, bilateral symmetry, unlocking legs, verbal communication in regions, and your physical thumbs, created in the image of God, like patented over creation.
Okay. So yeah, which that last point is part of the image of God. But we could have that kind of theological discussion another time. But yeah, so you've got a good biological definition of what it means to be human, a pretty good theological explanation of what it means to be human. What about back here?
Things we come up with are we have fresh blood, we have souls, and we have the ability to think for ourselves.
Okay.
We can change our environments to suit our needs.
Yeah, which other animals can do that, but we do seem to be unique in our ability to overcome our programming. And we'll come back to that. What about right here?
We can make decisions at the expense of ourselves.
Uh-huh.
We're rational, a soul, we're higher functioning. We can make emotional decisions, and we're made in the image of God.
Okay, love it. Similar themes up here.
Oh, nice. We're talking. Kind of. I mean, basically, obviously, creating the image of God, but beyond that, basically, there are some hominids, I should say, that definitely seem to be more on the ape side. Like Lucy, Australopithecus. While it seems like
Afarensis.
in general, within the species of Homo, or the genus of Homo, tend to be indications of human.
Yep.
Within Homo,
They tend to
Homo-
bury their dead. They tend to use tools. They tend
Exactly.
to have more complex
and they
societies. Yeah.
indicate that they're actually human at that point. But then, how do you define Homo from
Sure, and we'll talk about that. We have to finish this discussion and carry it on Monday because we are out of time. But one thing I want to leave you with is you don't have to be Homo sapiens to be human.
No.
And that's our species. But I'm going to leave you with that. You don't need to be Homo sapiens to be human.
So could a Neanderthal human mix have offspring that can
Oh, absolutely.
reproduce?